Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on the channel. Today we're going to talk about the second big release of the weekend. I already talked about Wicked here on the channel, and now it is time to talk about Gladiator II. This movie is once again directed by Ridley Scott, starring Connie, Nielsen, Paul Mescal, Denzel Washington, Pedro Pascal, Joseph Quinn, Fred Hechinger, along with so many other people in the giant ensemble that Ridley Scott has formed for this Gladiator sequel. And you know, the first Gladiator movie is really good. It's a great movie, but did it really ever need a sequel? But if we were to get a sequel out of it, I'm glad that it was this one in some ways, because I think this is a pretty decent follow-up to that first film, even though it does not live up quite to the heights of that original film. And of course, this will be a spoiler review for Gladiator 2, so if you have not had a chance to see it, and if you are a fan of that original movie, I don't think you will be disappointed from this movie, although I feel like I have heard a good amount of disappointment just from online chatter, especially from the screen unseen that happened on Monday. Just from the reactions out of that, I heard some people be disappointed in the movie itself, so I'm curious what the general, fans of that original Gladiator are going to think of this movie, because as somebody who didn't watch the original Gladiator until, just last week for the first time, I didn't grow up, I don't have that nostalgia for that movie, I think this is a pretty solid follow-up. So let's just jump right into it. So let's start off with the things that I enjoyed most about this movie, which is, of course, is going to land on the cast of this film that Ridley Scott assembled for this film, starting with Denzel Washington. I think Denzel Washington absolutely stole this entire movie, in the same way that Joaquin Phoenix kind of stole the show in the original movie, and in a way where this is the character, he doesn't necessarily have the same role that Joaquin Phoenix had. He was the emperor of that first one, whereas Denzel Washington is a character who encounters Paul Mescal, who is the gladiator in the Russell Crowe position in this movie. He's the one who acquires this slave and puts him in the gladiator matches, and is the one that is slowly gaining power in this world, getting closer to those emperors, and has the ability to pull the strings behind the scenes to get himself in a place of power. And I think that the way that they wrote this character, and of course Denzel Washington's very fun performance that he has inside of this film, was really entertaining to watch throughout the entire runtime. I will say that his character is kind of in the background for the first half of the movie, because he's more so scheming and plotting his evil plan that he's going to use to take over the entirety of Rome in this portion of the movie. But as soon as you get to the portion where Paul Mescal in the gladiator match for the first time in the Colosseum, and you see Connie Nielsen's reaction to him picking up the sand like his father once did all those years ago, which, again, spoilers, he is the son of Maximus, which I don't think anybody was really surprised by that. I feel like I knew that before going to this movie, and apparently it's supposed to be a reveal inside the movie itself. But yes, Paul Mescal's character is the son of both Connie Nielsen and Russell Crowe's character from that first film, and there's a whole plot point of him being sent away at the beginning of the movie, because now that he's the heir of the throne, he's going to have a lot of people going after him, and to keep him safe, she sent him away. And so now seeing him once again in this gladiatorial match, and Denzel Washington being in the background, seeing Connie Nielsen realize this in real time, and him being smart enough to piece together the puzzle that is the backstory of this character, was really interesting to see. That is his in at this point in the story, and that's why I think that Denzel's character is written so well in this movie, because yes, he is in the background for that first half, but you can see the gears turning in his head. You can see him realizing what he's going to do, and you can see him act out that plan to almost flawless degree, to the point where he does get almost essentially what he wanted, which is the people revolting against these emperors, and him being able to get into that seat of power behind that one Weasley emperor that is very easily manipulated and controlled. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the, I guess, good guys of the movie, which would be Connie Nielsen, Paul Mescal, and Pedro Pascal. To a certain extent, he is kind of a pseudo-antagonist for Paul Mescal's character, which I'll get into that in a second here. But I think Connie Nielsen, in terms of all those characters, was easily by far the best in this movie, and she's really the only person that carried through from that original film to this one. There's a couple other people in the Senate that I recognize from that first film, but Connie Nielsen has the most scenes in this movie. She is the one that brings the heart of this film, and she's the one who really grounds Paul Mescal's character in some sort of likability. And yes, I did only watch Gladiator for the first time last week, and so maybe I'm misremembering, but I don't remember Connie Nielsen having as many great scenes in that first movie as she does in this one. She has so many great, monologues and speeches, whether it's towards Pedro Pascal's character or Paul Mescal's character when she's trying to plead with her son to, reveal that it is him, to apologize for the things that she did in sending him away into this terrible world of Rome. And those sequences with Connie Nielsen, I think, are phenomenal. I think she is so great in all of those sequences. And when it comes to her death at the end of the film, I was extremely upset by it, because for one, it was done in a very unceremonious way, where you have Denzel Washington, fire off that arrow into the gladiatorial match, shooting her directly into the heart. And it's a very sad moment in the moment of it happening, but we move on from that so incredibly fast that it didn't feel as climactic of a moment for Paul Mescal's character as it should have been. And the other frustration I have with this character, because she was so prominent, because I was so happy with her role and her performance in this movie, was the fact that there were several shots in this movie where she was out of focus. Like, where is the AC? Where's the second AC, pulling the focus in the background of the scenes? Like, it just seemed like they set the focus point, and she was moving in and out of that focal distance, and just kept on being out of focus in several scenes in this movie. Not just one scene, several scenes in this movie, and it really only happened to her. This crazy that happened in this massive, big budget Ridley Scott's epic Gladiator sequel, that there are several shots of this movie that are out of focus when it pertains to this character. That's a very nitpicky thing from a cinematographer's perspective, but also, like, why? But either way, Connie Nielsen in this movie was great. And then you have Paul Mescal and Pedro Pascal in this movie, who are kind of taking the place of the Russell Crowe and the Joaquin Phoenix roles, where you have, I guess Pedro Pascal is kind of in the position that Russell Crowe was at the beginning of that film, where he's the general underneath these two emperors, and he's the one, acting out all these acts of war for them at the beginning of this movie, which led to the death of Paul Mescal's wife at the beginning opening scene of this film, and it kind of spiraled this character into this, plot for revenge. I will say that the first act of this movie, following suit with the original one, just kind of having the exact same beats, where you have our main character, his wife is killed, and that is motivating his, his revenge that he wants to pull for this story. And I don't think that Paul Mescal's motivation was as strong, because for one, Pedro Pascal was not the one who shot the arrow that killed his wife. He was just kind of angry at the way Rome is being run in general. He didn't have necessarily anger pointed directly towards Pedro Pascal's character, but he did still want to kill him because he was the face of that. And so I don't think that motivation was as strong, but as things become more complicated with these two characters, and realizing that Pedro Pascal's character is the new husband of Connie Nielsen, so this is a sort of stepfather of his, I think it became significantly more interesting. And I do wish that Pedro Pascal was in this movie more, because for one, I love Pedro Pascal. If anything, I hadn't watched the original Gladiator until last week, and so the reasons why I was excited for this movie was for Ridley Scott, for Pedro Pascal, and for Denzel Washington. Those were the three in the cast that I was extremely excited to see, and he does have a mostly prominent role in this film, but I wish we got more because of his, conflict of, being married to this woman that he absolutely loves, and he wants to revolt against these emperors because he does not like carrying out these acts of war anymore. He just wants to go back down and being a senator and, doing things for the people themselves instead of, going out and killing the future subjects of this Roman Empire. And I really like his dynamic with Connie Nielsen and Paul Mescal, because, he's being tasked to kill this character, even though, he doesn't want to, because it is the son of Connie Nielsen's character, and you have Paul Mescal, who wants to kill him because of things that he did, or at least he was tangentially related to the death of his wife. And so there's a lot of complications when it comes to those motivations and those conflicts and them meeting up in the gladiatorial match. I think that was all built up a lot more of an interesting way than it was, at least when it was first set up at the beginning. And then you have Paul Mescal in this movie, who is great in a lot of indie films before this point. Of course, he was in his Oscar-nominated role in After Sun, and also All of Us Strangers, which he was great in both those indie films. But this is the first time he's been in a big blockbuster Gladiator sequel, and so his performance in here was good. I did like him in this movie. I do think that I was not as on board with his character as I was with Russell Crowe because of the motivations that I mentioned a little bit earlier. But I think the thing that bothered me most about this character was he reminded me of somebody, and I couldn't for life me think of who he reminded me of. And as the film went on, I finally realized who he reminded me of, and that is, of course, James McAvoy in Speak No Evil. Of all roles of his, I think it's partly his facial hair, and he kind of looks like him at times in this role, but specifically his smile, his deranged looking smile, remind me very much of the character from Speak No Evil. And so I was unsettled by this guy instead of wanting to be rooting for him, because he had this sort of hatred behind his eyes of everybody in Rome against his mother, and that's kind of the point of his character. But it also made me a little bit distanced from him in terms of rooting for him as a character, because of course that first movie has such great motivation for Russell Crowe's path for revenge in that first film. And so yeah, it is a step down in terms of the main character here, but I think by the end he did sort of win me over. I did like his battle sequences that he had. He was really great in the physicality of the role, but I couldn't help but feel underwhelmed by the ending of the movie, especially when it comes to the death of Connie Nielsen and the lack of focus on that loss for his character, and also the speech that he had at the end, kind of bringing together these two armies of the Roman Empire, in this really hopeful and optimistic speech. I don't think that would be exactly how it went down in real life. Of course, this movie is not trying to be real in terms of being a based on true story type of thing for the Roman Empire. It is a movie, so it's going to embellish details like this, and so it didn't feel realistic to me. But also the first Gladiator movie didn't feel realistic in terms of how it ended, because even that first Gladiator movie ended in a very hopeful and optimistic note, and obviously, of course, we see how things went in this sequel, and so who knows how it would go after the ending point of this movie, and whether Paul Mescal's character is actually going to be a good leader moving forward, or if he even wants to be a leader moving forward. And of course, we have the two emperors played by Joseph Quinn and Fred Hechinger, which, a side note here, it's really great to see Pedro Pascal and Joseph Quinn have a scene together inside of this movie, because of course, we're going to see them together a lot in the Fantastic Four movie later next year, and I cannot wait for that. But in terms of the two emperors inside of this film, I think their performances were good in it, although, you're comparing them to Joaquin Phoenix in that first film, who was completely, just terrifying and really great and just, unsettling inside of that role, and this very calm and sadistic demeanor that he has inside of that first film. Whereas this movie, you have Joseph Quinn, who is kind of the smarter one of this, twin duo that you have here, whereas the other guy is very much the unhinged, very, inept and incompetent emperor in this duo. And, this guy was so weaselly, and he was clearly not going to do anything smart, and he's the character that is going to be very easily manipulated, whereas Joseph Quinn is the character that is going to be a little bit more able to push against, Denzel Washington's vibe for power. And so those two characters, I didn't really care too much for them. They were kind of in the background. They didn't really have too much of a role. I did like the times that Joseph Quinn was kind of more in your face. I think that Fred Hechinger plays that Weasley type of character really well, but again, when you're comparing it against Joaquin Phoenix, they just don't hold a candle to those two characters. And so that's why Denzel Washington kind of took a step forward, and why I liked his character so much, because he was more so the comparison to the Joaquin Phoenix type of role in this film than those two had. I also really liked Alexander Karim in this movie as Ravi. This was a character who's kind of like the second hand to Paul Mescal's character, a buddy of his that he kind of gains a friendship throughout this movie of being, his doctor, patching up at scenes, but he was also the character who he was able to convince to go get Pedro Pascal's army after the death of Pedro Pascal, to round up this group, to tell him that he is the Prince of Rome, and to, gather all these troops to bring them into the city. And I really like that that was the role that he ended up getting. He was able to, gain confidence in himself to rise up and be more than he was, meant to be. Even though it ended up a little bit climactic with the role that army played at the end of the film, I still didn't enjoy that this friendship was blossoming with these two characters that made, both Paul Mescal and this character a little bit more likable throughout. But let's of course switch gears over to the technical side of this movie, including Ridley Scott's direction, the action sequences, and the CGI. And I will say that Ridley Scott hasn't missed a day. He honestly, at his age, making a film as big and as epic as this movie ended up being is really impressive from a, behind the camera standpoint. I really love Ridley Scott's direction of making something as epic as this film feels throughout the entirety of the runtime. And those action sequences are great throughout the entire thing. I don't think there's a single action sequence I was disappointed in, quite frankly. And yeah, I've heard some disappointment with some people saying that the visual effects in this movie are, not good. But also, yes, you had a real tiger inside of that first film, but obviously you're not going to be able to have a real rhino on set or real baboons on set in the way that they had them inside this film. Of course, the shark sequence, which I'll get into in a second here. But quite frankly, I think the visual effects here are a lot more even and consistent than other blockbusters that we have, releasing in theaters today. And so I didn't mind that sort of stuff, because I think the action sequences and the way they're directed and the way they're shot are, good enough to make me, look past the fact that, yes, I am looking at CGI animals, but they looked real enough, and the intensity of the direction was enough for me to look past it, because it never looked bad by any means. It never looked like, Black Panther at the ending of that film with those rhinos. The rhino looked a lot better in this, and they didn't have as prominent of a role. They were there in some of the action sequences, but they weren't the focus of it, because the focus was, of course, on the actual characters themselves, with Paul Mescal, dealing with all these situations, and the way that he's, getting himself in a position to be a good leader, to lead all these other gladiators to face against all these different, obstacles that they're going to face throughout this movie. And so, yes, I do think that all the gladiator matches, even with the larger-than-life obstacles like the baboons, the rhinos, and the sharks that he faced inside of this movie, was all still extremely entertaining. And yes, it is a sequel that is trying to be bigger and better than the first one. I think the action sequences do exactly just that. And yes, the Colosseum sequence where it is filled with water, and they have the boats, and they have the sharks in the water, I don't know, I had a lot of fun with that sequence. I can see how some people can, make fun of it for the historical accuracy. I don't know, I wasn't there in ancient Rome. Maybe they were able to get sharks, maybe they weren't. But we do know that they did fill it with water at some points in history, so why not throw sharks in there? I don't know, it is a movie, they embellish things like that all the time inside of films, so why not? But overall, I did really end up enjoying this movie, and as somebody who, again, watched Gladiator for the first time last week, that's not a movie that I, revere as strongly as a lot of people do. And I understand that if you walk out of this movie with some sort of disappointment because you have, Gladiator as one of your favorite movies of all time, and yes, you watch this movie, and it's just a really solid action movie, it's a really good movie, it's not a great movie, then yeah, I can see you being disappointed in it. But as somebody who thought the original Gladiator was, really good, almost great at times, this movie just feels really good. So yes, it is a step down. I don't think that there's anything really besides, I guess, the only thing that I really liked more about this movie than the first one was Denzel's turn and him, realizing that there was a separate army that, Pedro Pascal was, rounding up in the outskirts of the city to take over Rome, and he figured it all out, and you get to see his process in figuring that all out, and how the betrayal of that and capturing those characters, and how he was able to manipulate his way into power. I think that is a lot better done than inside of the first movie, where you had the same sort of storyline where Connie Nielsen was trying to, work around something with some of the other senators to be able to do an uprising against Joaquin Phoenix's character. And in that movie, you have somebody, tattle on them, and it's very quick the way that kind of wraps up, and it kind of fades away into the background. It's not really a plot point where you actually focus on how all that stuff is done behind the scenes. This one, you do get to see all that. So in that way, I think that is really the only thing that I thought was better than the first one. I think the protagonist is better than the first one. I think the Emperor is better than the first one. I think the actual conflict and motivation of Russell Crowe's character in that revenge story is better than the story in this one. But that all being said, I still had a lot of fun watching Gladiator on the big screen here this weekend, and it's a great weekend. Go ahead and watch Wicked. It's a really great movie. Go ahead and watch, Gladiator. It's a really, really great movie as well. And so I liked both of these films. I think they're a great, counter program to have in theaters. So you have a lot of options here in theaters this weekend, along with, a lot of the stuff that's on streaming as well. Of course, I talked about the Creep tapes last week. I cannot wait to watch the new episode later today as well. And just all the things that are going on in theaters right now. It's just a lot of fun to go out to watch movies and to talk about them with you guys as well. But that is going to be it for me for my review for Gladiator 2. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this film as well in the comment section down below. Did you guys like it? Did you guys hate it? Well, you were disappointed greatly because you're such a fan of that original movie. I'm very curious to hear your perspective in the comment section down below. But that'll be it for me. If you did enjoy, make sure to leave a like, comment down below, subscribe to the channel to see more reviews just like this one. I hope to see you all in my next video.